I was elbow deep in the engine bay of a '94 Camry at 5:45 in the morning when he showed up unannounced. Not Marcus. Marcus hadn't seen the inside of a garage before noon in the entire 4 years we were together. I was crouched over the carburetor, grease on my forearms, a flashlight clenched between my teeth, and the bay door half open to let in the early air. The shop was empty. That was the point. I had opened it an hour before the staff arrived every single day for the past 6 months because those 60 minutes were the only time the place felt like mine again. I heard boots on the concrete, unhurried, not the shuffle of someone lost. A shadow fell across the hood. I pulled the flashlight from my teeth and looked up. He was standing at the entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets, head tilted slightly, reading the engine like a person who'd spent time around engines. He said nothing for a moment, then casually, without introduction, "You've got an air leak between the intake manifold and the throttle body. I can hear it from here." He wasn't wrong. I'd been chasing that sound for 20 minutes. I set the flashlight down on the fender. He didn't come closer. He just stood there with the same easy stillness of someone who had nowhere else to be and no particular need to prove it. My name is Serena Cole, 34 years old, automotive technician and the owner of Cole's Auto on the east side of the city, the same shop my father built from scratch in 1987 and handed to me piece by piece until the day he retired. I have been rebuilding engines since I was 11. I can diagnose a knock by sound alone and tell the difference between a failing head gasket and a warped block without touching either. I am methodical, precise, and I do not like surprises. I want to say that clearly before I tell you the rest of this story, because what happened over the following 11 days was almost entirely made up of surprises, and every single one of them arrived through the side door I had left half open for the morning air. His name was Daniel Reeves. He was Marcus's older brother. The first time I'd met him was at a backyard birthday party 3 years into the relationship. He'd been standing near the fence line away from the noise, drinking something from a can and watching the group the way a person watches traffic, noting patterns without needing to be part of it. Marcus had pulled me over and introduced us. Daniel had shaken my hand, looked at the grease still faintly visible under my thumbnail from a job that morning, and said without any ceremony whatsoever, "You work with your hands." I'd said yes. He'd nodded once, like that was interesting, then let the conversation move on without trying to hold it. I hadn't thought much about him after that. He appeared occasionally over the years. A holiday dinner. The weekend Marcus and I moved into the house together. A handful of moments I filed away without particular attention. He was always quiet in the way that certain people are quiet, not from shyness or discomfort, but from a genuine preference for listening over performing. I'd noticed it without naming it. Now, the morning of day 2 of his unplanned stay, he was standing in my garage at 5:45 a.m., identifying an air leak by sound, and I still hadn't moved from beside the engine. The situation I need to explain is this. Marcus and I separated 8 months ago. The relationship ended the way long, slow things end, not in a single crack, but in a gradual settling, like a foundation that shifts 1 millimeter at a time until the doors no longer close flush. We'd been together 4 years. We'd moved into the house together 2 years in. We were building something in theory. In practice, I was building it, and Marcus was observing the construction with mild approval, occasionally suggesting features he thought we needed without inquiring about the cost. That's not entirely fair, but it's mostly true. The lease is in both our names, and neither of us can afford to buy the other out until the end of the current rental period, which lands in 4 months. The landlord won't allow a unilateral transfer without both signatures and written agreement. So we are in the house together for 4 more months, following a careful geometry of separate spaces. Marcus has the primary bedroom. I have the second room, which I converted into a combination office and storage the moment I understood the separation was real. The kitchen is shared. The living room is shared. The backyard is available to both of us, and neither of us uses it because using it would require proximity neither of us is currently seeking. We are civil. Completely civil. That is somehow the worst part of it. Before Marcus, I was a clear person. I knew what I wanted from a day. I woke up early. I opened the shop. I did work that I could see and touch and hold the results of in my hands. I was direct. Not unkind, but I did not soften things I didn't need to soften. If there was a problem with a car, I said what the problem was. If there was a problem with a situation, I said the same. I brought that directness home with me every night and believed it was a gift to whoever I was with. What I eventually understood was that Marcus didn't experience it as a gift. He experienced it as a light he was always slightly squinting against. He wanted evenings that didn't have edges. I gave him evenings with corners. Neither of us was wrong exactly. We were just not particularly suited to each other's company in the long run, and we had both been polite enough not to say so clearly until it had been true for over a year. There was no dramatic ending. We were sitting in the kitchen on a Sunday evening, and Marcus set down his fork and said, "I think we've been pretending for a while." I agreed. We didn't raise our voices. We were decent to each other. And then we spent the next month figuring out that we couldn't separate the living arrangement cleanly. And now here we were, two strangers in a house we'd once called home, managing it like a shared work project neither of us had wanted, but both felt obligated to complete professionally. Then Daniel arrived. Not because of the separation, or not directly. His own situation had shifted. A sublease had fallen through in another city, and Marcus had offered the couch for a few weeks while things got sorted. I was informed by text the night before he arrived. Not asked. Informed. That was another small, accurate portrait of what we were by that point. The first morning, I went to the garage before 5. He found me there before 6. I don't know what instinct brought him that direction. The shop is 3 blocks from the house. He'd presumably walked. He stood at the bay door in the same jacket from the night before and identified an air leak without being invited to. I should have been irritated. I wasn't. And that was the first surprise. I pointed to the throttle body, and he crossed the bay without any performance of being welcomed, crouched beside the engine, and ran 2 fingers along the manifold gasket until he found the gap. "Right there," he said. I handed him the socket wrench I was already holding. He took it without making anything of the gesture. We worked side by side for 30 minutes without having a conversation about it. When the job was done, I locked up the bay and we walked back to the house in the early light without discussing what had just happened. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table without asking if that was all right. And I found that I didn't mind, which was the second surprise, because I had been minding almost everything about the arrangement for 6 months. There are things you forget about yourself when you're inside something that doesn't fit. I had forgotten that I used to enjoy company in the mornings. With Marcus, mornings had been quiet because Marcus needed quiet in the mornings, and I had adjusted without being asked. The way I had adjusted to a number of things without being asked, treating each small adjustment as flexibility and calling that a virtue. What I was actually doing was learning to occupy less space and naming it consideration. By the end of year 3, I had made myself so adaptable that I had nearly disappeared. I didn't notice while it was happening. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. I thought I was being a good partner. I thought accommodation was love. It is not the same thing. Love has edges. Accommodation files them off until everything is smooth and nothing holds purchase, and there is no longer any particular reason to stay or go because you have made yourself so perfectly frictionless that your presence or absence barely registers differently to the person sharing your house. I was still. That is what I was. Still and smooth and entirely present and somehow completely invisible. I understood this over time. I'm not sure I could have said it clearly while I was inside it. The morning of day 3, Daniel was already at the shop when I arrived. He was sitting on the concrete outside the bay door with a coffee cup from the place 2 streets over, reading something on his phone. He looked up when he heard the key in the lock and said nothing about being there. Neither did I. I opened the bay. He finished his coffee and then stood up and came over without ceremony. There was a Honda with a transmission issue I'd been putting off because the job was straightforward, but long, and I hadn't wanted to start it alone. We got into it together without a conversation about whether we would. That was how most of those mornings went. He didn't volunteer much about himself, and I didn't ask with any pressure. I knew the broad facts. He was 38, 2 years older than Marcus. He had spent 12 years working marine vessel maintenance on the coast before relocating inland for reasons he described only as it was time to be somewhere different. He wasn't looking for sympathy or explanation. He offered the information the way a person offers their name, as context, not as the heart of the matter. What I observed about him during those mornings was this. He worked at the pace the job required, not faster, not slower. He didn't guess when he wasn't certain. He asked direct questions and accepted direct answers without recalibrating his expression to indicate how he felt about them. When something was difficult, he slowed down. He didn't make the difficulty into a performance or pretend it wasn't there. He simply addressed it at the appropriate speed. I realized on day 5 that I had not felt the need to minimize what I was doing in front of him a single time. Not once had I instinctively softened my expertise or apologized for knowing what I was talking about. I had not preemptively adjusted my tone or my pace or my occupation of space to make him more comfortable with any of it. I had simply been myself at full volume in my own garage, and he had been there without asking me to turn it down. I did not know what to do with that at first. It felt too simple. The thing I had been missing for years, and it was that uncomplicated. Someone who simply did not require me to be smaller. That morning, near the end of the Honda job, he said without looking up from the gearbox, "You don't talk much about what's going on inside the house." I said there wasn't much to say. He turned a bolt and said, "That's not the same as nothing being wrong." I kept working. Then said, "How long have you known your brother and I weren't working?" He considered the question honestly. "About a year," he said. "Maybe more." I asked why he'd never said anything. He looked up. It wasn't mine to say. I didn't argue with that. I understood it. He had held his observation without inserting it where it hadn't been invited. That was a kind of discipline I recognized. That night at the house, Marcus was in the living room watching something on his laptop with headphones on. Daniel and I came in from the garage in the same clothes we'd left in, grease on both of us. And Marcus glanced up once and went back to his screen without comment. Something in that small moment told me everything I needed to know about the distance that had accumulated. Not bitterness, not any remaining pain, just the final clarity of seeing something fully for what it had been. Day 6. Daniel asked about my father's shop. I told him the full version. My father had built it as a one-bay operation working weekends out of the original structure. He had grown it over 20 years to a 4-bay shop with 3 employees. When his hands had started to give him trouble, he had brought me in officially rather than sell to an outside buyer. He had retired on a Tuesday and not looked back. I had been running it solo for 4 years. I had expanded the bay capacity once and added a diagnostic system in the 2nd year and had turned away 0 work since the 1st quarter. I told him all of this without softening any of it. He listened without performing his attention, asking 2 specific questions that told me he had actually followed what I was saying. When I finished, he said, "You built something real." That was the whole sentence. He didn't add that it must be hard, or that he was impressed, or any of the cushioning language people usually add when what they mean is good job. He just said what it was, and let it be what it was. I walked back to the car we were working on and understood something had shifted. Not dramatically, more like a panel that had been slightly out of alignment settling into its correct position. A small correction with a significant effect on how the whole thing ran. Day 7, he found the starter motor issue on a truck that had been giving me trouble all week. I'd been testing the wrong component. He mentioned it without any implication that I should have caught it sooner, which I should have. And I knew it. I said so. He said the noise signature is deceptive on that model. Then we fixed it. Day 8, it rained hard enough that the street outside flooded past the curb. We sat inside the bay with the door 3/4 down and went through the month's outstanding invoices because I'd been putting that off, and he had a background in logistics record-keeping from the marine work. He had a very organized mind, cleaner than mine in that particular domain. I let him work on the system without managing how he did it. When he found 2 billing errors I'd missed, he told me plainly, without any theater. I corrected them. Neither of us made it into an event. Marcus called while we were going through the invoices. I stepped outside under the bay door overhang to take it. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. It was about a piece of mail that had arrived. Administrative. Completely functional. When I came back in, Daniel was still working on the file without having registered any curiosity about the call. I sat back down and we continued. Later that afternoon, he said, without context, "You seem better in here than you do in the house." I said, "I know." That was the entirety of the exchange, but I replayed it walking home that evening and understood it as the most precise observation anyone had made about me in years. Not a compliment, not a criticism, just an accurate account of something real, delivered without any agenda attached to it. On day 9, I arrived at the shop, and he wasn't there. I worked through the first 2 hours in the quiet I had originally come to rely on. Somewhere in the second hour, I noticed I was listening for boots on the concrete. I didn't name it then. I just noticed it the way you notice an absence that you weren't prepared to measure. He came in mid-morning. Something had come up with a call from the coast. He'd dealt with it from the house. He didn't explain further. I didn't ask. He crossed the bay and picked up where he'd left off the day before, without any disruption to the rhythm. The rhythm itself surprised me. I had been working alone in this shop for years. I had a staff who arrived at 8 and did good work. I had no problem with solitude. I had built my mornings around it deliberately. And yet, whatever Daniel and I had built in those early hours had its own pace now, its own structure, and working inside it felt more natural to me than the solitude I had carefully constructed. I didn't know what to do with that. I held it for the rest of the day without reaching a conclusion. Day 10, the bay door was open early. I was already inside when he arrived. He brought 2 coffees from the street corner place, set one on the fender beside me without a word. I kept working. He took off his jacket, draped it over the hood of the waiting car, and got started on his own end. We worked for 2 hours. The morning was clear, and the air through the door was the specific temperature it only reaches in the first part of the day before the city gets warm. I thought about the version of this shop from my father's time, the original single bay, the smell of the same oil in the same concrete floor. The version of the place before I owned it and the weight of owning it had changed what it felt like to be in it. Something about the morning and the coffee on the fender and the uncomplicated company made the shop feel the way it had when I was 11 and simply happy to be there. On the afternoon of day 10, Marcus asked me in the kitchen if Daniel had been helping at the shop. His tone was curious, but not pointed. I said yes. He nodded in a way that meant several things at once and said nothing further. The geometry of the house shifted slightly after that, in ways too small to measure but present nonetheless. Day 11, Daniel and I finished a full break and suspension job that would have taken me most of 2 days alone. We finished before the staff arrived. He stood at the sink in the shop washroom running water over his hands, and I stood beside him doing the same, and he said, "You've got a good place here." I said, "My father built it." He said, "You've kept it. There is a difference." I looked at him in the mirror over the sink. He was looking at his own hands, not waiting for me to respond, not performing the statement, just saying the thing he'd meant. I understood in that moment that I had been waiting for someone to recognize that for years and had not known I was waiting. The afternoon of day 11, I was in the office going through the week's paperwork when he knocked on the frame of the open door. He said, "I've sorted the coast situation. I'll be heading back the day after tomorrow." I looked up. I said, "All right." He said, "I wanted to tell you directly rather than have you find out through Marcus." I set the pen down. I said, "I appreciate that." He nodded once and went back to the bay. I sat in the office for several minutes without doing anything. I wasn't upset. I wasn't in any position to be upset, and that wasn't even the right word for what I was sitting with. It was something more like recognition. Something had been real and was ending before I'd had enough time to understand its full shape. I went back to the paperwork. I finished it. I was efficient about it. That was how I handled things. Day 12, I came in before the sun and worked by flashlight until the light shifted to gray. He arrived at the usual time with no coffee that morning, which I noted without mentioning. We worked through the morning. Around 10, I dropped a socket wrench and it skidded under the car, and he retrieved it without me having to ask and set it back in my hand without making anything of the contact. I kept working. In the afternoon, he said without leading up to it, "The thing in the house with Marcus, that's going to resolve itself cleanly." He wasn't telling me something I didn't know. He was confirming it in the way that certain people confirm things, not to provide information, but to let you know you've been seen accurately. I said, "I know." He said, "You'll have the shop and the next version of everything." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I just wanted to say it out loud so someone had." I held that for a moment. Then I said, "That message you sent Marcus 6 months ago, the one he showed me because he thought it would bother me, the one where you told him he ought to be honest with me sooner?" He went quiet. I said, "It didn't bother me. It was the most honest thing anyone said about the situation until then." He nodded slowly. He said, "I wasn't sure if that was overstepping." I said, "It was. It also wasn't wrong." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Day 13, I arrived at the shop and he was already inside. Starting on a fuel pump job, he'd clearly pulled the notes on the night before. He'd already laid out the correct tools in the correct sequence on the bench. I stood in the bay door and looked at the layout for a moment. Then I said, "You've done fuel pumps before?" He said, "More than I can count." I came in. We worked. That was the morning of day 13. In the afternoon, the front bell rang and the first customer of the day came in with a check engine light and a story that took longer to tell than it needed to. I handled it. Daniel stayed in the bay. When I came back, he was finishing the fuel pump job and he looked up and said, "What was the actual problem?" I told him. He said, "That's not what they described." I said, "It never is." He smiled then. A full one. Unhurried and real. Not arranged for the occasion, but actually present. I turned back to the car I was working on, but I kept that smile somewhere in my peripheral vision for the rest of the afternoon. I'm not sure I've done that. Kept something in the corner of my vision like something I wasn't ready to fully address. In a very long time. The morning of day 14, I opened the shop early and he was not there. I worked alone. The quiet was familiar. It had been my quiet before any of this, carefully maintained, valuable to me, enough. It was still all of those things, but it had a new outline to it now, the faint shape of something that had recently been in the space and was no longer. He came in 40 minutes later. He set his jacket on the hood of the car we'd been working. He said, "I'm leaving after lunch." I said, "I know." He said, "You have my number. Marcus has my number, obviously. But I mean, you have it independently if you ever." He stopped. I said, "I know what you mean." He nodded once. We worked through the morning. Around 11, the staff started arriving, and the shop filled up with the regular noise of the day, the radio, the air compressor, the particular percussion of multiple people working on different things at once. Daniel worked in the bay alongside everyone else without needing to be introduced to the pace of it. He fit inside the rhythm without disrupting it. I noticed that. I noticed it clearly and filed it without pretending I hadn't. He left at 12:30. He came to the office where I was writing up an estimate and said, "The shop is in good hands," meaning mine. Not as a pleasantry, as a statement of fact. I looked up. I said, "I'll let you know if I ever need a second opinion on a marine engine." He said, "I'll answer." He walked back through the bay and out the front door, and the bell above the door rang the way it rang for everyone. And then he was gone. I sat with the estimate in front of me for a moment. Then I finished it. The work was still there. The work was always there, and I had built it myself, and it was mine, and it held. 4 months later, the lease ended and the house situation resolved the way it was always going to. Marcus and I signed the appropriate paperwork with our respective attorneys present and were returned to being two individuals who had once shared a lease and were now fully separate. I rented a place 6 blocks from the shop, ground floor with a long workbench along one wall that the previous tenant had left. I bought a good lamp for it and moved in over one weekend. The first morning I woke up there, I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard and felt the specific weight of a place that is only yours and no one else's. Every surface in the apartment was arranged by my own preference. Every object was in the location I had chosen. No unspoken schedule, no careful geometry of avoidance. Just a place that matched the person living in it. Daniel and I had been messaging since the day he left. Not every day. Consistently, without urgency or pressure in either direction. He sent a photograph one evening of an engine bay on a commercial vessel with a caption that said, "Familiar problem, different scale." I replied, "Same fix, longer wrench." That was the register we operated in. Direct, specific, economical with words, meaning present in the gaps. He drove to the city on a Saturday 3 weeks after I moved in. We walked the industrial stretch near the river, where a lot of the older commercial garages are, and talked about the ones that had been converted and the ones that were still working. For lunch, we ate at a place with outdoor seating and looked at the water. Near the end of it, he asked, "How is the apartment?" I said, "It fits." He said, "Good." And he reached across the table and straightened the edge of the menu that was sitting slightly crooked and did not take his hand all the way back for a moment, and I did not move mine. We didn't categorize it that afternoon. Neither of us needed to. Some things are already named by the time anyone speaks them aloud. What had built between us in early mornings and engine bays and plain sentences that neither of us cushioned had been accumulating its own meaning for weeks. It didn't require a formal occasion to be real. I don't tell this story to talk about Marcus. I want to be specific about that. The honest version of Marcus is that he was a person who was not suited to the person I actually am, and I stayed longer than I should have because I had made myself so small inside the arrangement that it no longer felt urgent to change it. I confused absence of conflict with presence of something good. That is a specific and common mistake. I don't blame him for it. I blame myself for being so fluent in shrinking. Daniel didn't find me. He didn't come to the shop with a plan. He showed up at an open bay door with a coffee in one hand and noticed an air leak that I'd been circling for 20 minutes, and he said the accurate thing without softening it or offering me anything other than his honest observation. That was the whole entry point. One person who looked directly at what they saw and said it plainly. No architecture to it. Just a clear-eyed account of the thing in front of them. Now I work in a shop that belongs entirely to me. My tools are where I put them. My schedule is mine. My mornings are my own, even when someone else is in them, because the someone else does not require me to disappear to make room for their comfort. I am the same size in the room when he's present as when he's not. That is not a small thing. That is, I am learning. Almost the entire thing. Have you ever made yourself smaller inside a situation and called it maturity? And then met someone who saw you at full size and didn't look away from any of it? Some things we build together are made of concrete and steel and hold weight across years. Other things we build are made of morning hours and plain sentences and coffee set on a fender without ceremony. And those hold just as well if you understand what you're working with. If any part of this stayed somewhere true for you, leave a line in the comments. One sentence is enough. I read everyone. If you want more stories about people who stopped disappearing and started taking up the right amount of space, subscribe. I'll be back with the next one. There is something I want to add here that I did not know how to say while the story was still moving forward. Something I understood only after I had enough distance to look at the whole shape of it clearly. The shop has been in my life longer than any relationship I've been in. I've had it since before I knew what kind of person I would become. It was there when I was 11, and there when I was 23, and struggling through the first year of full ownership, and there every single morning for the 6 worst months of the lease situation. The shop did not require me to be any particular version of myself to remain. It was constant in a way that I had not recognized as a gift until I was standing inside it with someone who also understood what it meant to be that kind of steady. There is a specific kind of grief that arrives when you stop accommodating and realize how much of yourself you had been storing away. You do not feel it all at once. It comes in sections, over weeks, in quiet moments, standing over an engine that needs the same honest assessment you are learning to extend to your own life. You think, I could have said that sooner. I could have held that boundary 3 years ago. I could have stopped adjusting when adjustment was no longer a gift but a slow disappearance. The grief is not dramatic. It does not arrive in single visible waves. It settles in the way sediment settles, quietly and completely, and leaving the water clearer after. I am clearer now. I say this without pride or performance. I am simply a person who took up less space than I was built for and is now in the slow process of relearning how much space is appropriate. The tools on my bench are organized the way I organize them. The schedule on the shop wall is the one I wrote. The coffee in the morning is made exactly the way I like it with no adjustments for anyone else's preference. These are not small liberties. These are the cumulative measurement of a life that fits the person living it. And there is a man who drove 3 hours to walk an industrial riverfront with me and straightened a menu edge at lunch and did not pretend that meant nothing. Who sends photographs of engine bays on vessels in harbors I've never seen with captions that require no explanation. Who worked beside me in a garage before sunrise without needing to make any part of it into a larger statement than it was. Who told me I had kept something my father built and understood that keeping it was its own form of building. I did not plan for any of that. I could not have designed it in advance. The best structures hold not because they were planned perfectly, but because the materials were honest and the person who built them was paying attention. I was paying attention. That is, finally, enough.